Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's Senza Fili Sparring Partners webinar on Midband in the U.S. Strategy After the Auction. Our speakers today are Monica Paolini, Principal at Senza Fili, and Amit Nagpal, Partner at Aetha Consulting. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I will be moderating our webinar today. In Sparring Partners webinars, we watch our two speakers debate a topic on screen without slides. We would like to encourage our audience to participate in the conversation. Please share your comments and questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We ask that everyone please keep the conversation polite and respectful. Our debaters will do their best to address questions as they go along and as they become relevant to the topics being discussed. So please do not hold your questions until the end. And finally, we will be live tweeting the webinar today. You can follow along or participate on Twitter using the hashtag Sparring Partners. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monica.
Hi, Kendra. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to have Amit with us again. And so what we're going to talk about today is the mid-band, the results of the mid-band auction in the U.S. And it's great to have Amit because he is not always focusing his work on spectrum, but he also has a wider view of what's happening, not just in the U.S., but in the rest of the world. So I think we're going to look into what happens, what does this mean for the U.S., but also try to just see, how does it compare to what happens, what happened and happens as it's happening in other countries. So with that said, I'm going to give a brief introduction to this. But before we do that, I would like to ask Amit to introduce himself. And Amit and I have been, known each other for countless years. We're not going to go back, and we used to work together, and he was my next desk. We spent a lot of time together in Taiwan, as a matter of fact. And so I know him very well, but I want you to know what he's doing, his background. So Amit, why don't you start? And thanks a lot for participating to the Sparring Partner today.
Oh, thanks, Monica, for inviting me to.
You're on mute, Amit.
Oh, are you sure?
No.
Can you hear me? Because it's not saying mute here.
Yeah, I can hear you, Amit. I think Monica might have some audio issues.
He was able to. We were able to hear. I don't know. I cannot hear him. I don't know whether other people can hear him.
I'll try again.
Nope.
Okay. So we might end up having a debate with me making my points and unfortunately Monica not being able to hear it. But I'll do my intro in the meantime, just while Monica sorts herself out. So I'm a partner at Aetha Consulting, and Aetha Consulting is a specialist telecoms consultancy advising on strategy and regulatory issues. And in particular, my own experience, I've been working in spectrum now for 30 years, initially for the UK regulator, which became part of Ofcom, and then I moved into consultancy. And I've been involved in spectrum valuations and the likes for over 20 years now, including, as Monica mentioned, we did a piece of work over in Taiwan many years ago. Can you hear me now, Monica? Are you?
Yeah, yes, I'm so sorry.
Okay,
it was actually my problem, not yours. I don't know what happened.
No problem. Anyway, I've just given an introduction to myself, as you heard. So let's get into the real stuff.
Okay, so I didn't hear your introduction and what you said, but I probably know what you said.
Okay. I didn't say anything bad about you. Don't worry.
You had your opportunity to say all sorts of bad things, but anyway. So okay, so what happened? So probably most of you know, so I'm going to be quite brief in terms of what happened in the US with the mid-band auction. So in the US, the mid-band spectrum has been up to now very limited in terms compared to other countries. So there was a huge demand and a huge expectation because operators needed to have mid-band spectrum, and that increased obviously the attention to the auction and the prices paid. So what happened is that in auction 107, the overall fees paid are $81 billion, and most of the biggest bidder was Verizon. They got 80 to what is it 80 to 160 megahertz, so 60 to 182 in most markets, and they paid 53 billion out of 81, so a huge amount. AT&T came second, 27 billion dollars, and they had a very different strategy in terms of trying to get the same amount of spectrum throughout the US. Than T-Mobile, who has a more spectrum available in the mid band, because they have a lot of spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band from the acquisition of Sprint. They spent $100 billion, and they focused on specific markets where they had the need. So much more focused. So Verizon everywhere, but there was some difference in terms of how much spectrum they got in different markets. AT&T tried to cover everything. T-Mobile specific markets. Cable operators didn't get any. Dish got very little. And what else? Now, the interesting part is how much people paid, and the answer is quite a lot. So they paid 1.1, 1.1, 1.6 dollars per pop per megahertz, if you include the clearing costs which are associated with the band. And the difference in price was whether they paid for some of the spectrum is available in 2021, some is available in 2023, and that's obviously operators were paying less for that. Now, to give you some sort of a comparison, so 1.1 for midband. For CBRS, the price was 0.2, so much lower, but there was less spectrum. This was a very different type of spectrum because it was much less power and more limitations. Compared to the rest of the world, the price was pretty much half as much. Give and take, there's a lot of variability, but so it's like twice as much as most of other countries. And so the question is, did people pay did the operators pay too much? So maybe what we should do is that start with the first poll, ask you what you think, and then we can get back to you so that you can get, we can get your unbiased view on that. So Kendra, can we start with the first poll, and then I would like to ask Amit to comment, to give his insight on what's happening.
Okay, our first poll. In the mid-band auction in the US, did the bidders pay too little, the right price, or too much?
Okay. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what people think. So I look forward to you all giving your vote and seeing the outcome. But in the meantime, I think my perspective was, we had a sort of previous webinar on this topic, and I think I gave my sort of perspective that I thought the price would end up, I think, around 40 cents, 45 cents per megahertz pop. So clearly we've ended up sort of something like double that in terms of the outcome. And I think the interesting thing for me when I sort of saw the outcome really was just how much spectrum Verizon had acquired in the auction. If you look at it, probably on average, if you look across the markets, it's quite about 160 megahertz of the spectrum. That's 160 of the 280, which is kind of like, I don't know what that works out, 57, 58% of the total spectrum. Now, if you'd said to me going in, is Verizon going to get a lot of spectrum? I would have said absolutely yes. Would I have said it would get 58% of the whole band? I wouldn't have expected that. So probably you can see if one bidder went in with a strategy saying, I really want to get a huge amount of this, over half of the spectrum, considering that there's a good few bidders in this auction, it's not really surprising the price ended up so high in the end. But obviously I don't think, well, I certainly didn't expect Verizon to be looking for so much there. AT&T, 80 megahertz, you would expect, it needs additional mid-band spectrum to have a good 5G offering. So exactly what you would expect. In fact, possibly you would have expected it to end up with a bit more, 100, maybe possibly 120. T-Mobile has ended up with with 40 megahertz or 40 megahertz in certain areas. And that makes sense, as Monica discussed, because it's got this sort of a good, strong 2.5 gigahertz spectrum holding. And I guess it was in the auction just to sort of get a little bit of extra spectrum in some areas to sort of kind of future-proof itself if it needs it for additional capacity. So that's not entirely surprising. And then, of course, we have other bidders which have picked up some. But I guess, as I say, the big surprise is how much Verizon got, and AT&T got a bit less. And probably Verizon's desire for lots was the driver of the price ultimately.
Yeah, sort of housekeeping here. Feel free to if you don't have questions but you have comments, feel free to send those too. It's always great to see what you guys think as well on top of the polls. And there is a link that Amit sent, which is has a lot of the summary of the results. So if you want to have some more background, look at there. And Kendra, can you go over the results?
Yes. So it looks like 70% of our audience thought that bidders paid too much, 28% thought they paid the right price, and 3% thought it was too little.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is an easy. I mean, it's, well, easy. As you say, yes, they end up paying so much more than any other countries and more than we'd expect. But I think that in a way, it was inevitable because Verizon was so desperate. I mean, not desperate. It was so eager, I should say, to get spectrum that kind of that rises the prices. It's just it's a demand and supply type of thing. So. They needed the spectrum, and so they went for it. Now, the question that as I was thinking about it is, well, if we had a Sprint, so if we had 4 operators, and the 4 operators had a more sort of even distribution of spectrum, would that have been different? And the issue here is that clearly the reason why Verizon was so motivated is the fact that T-Mobile had much more spectrum. So there is an uneven situation, an uneven distribution of spectrum that oftentimes you do not have in other country. And I think that kind of drove the price to go high. Although surprisingly, AT&T was not as aggressive, I guess.
I mean, possibly you would argue that AT&T, so it's looking at the bidding behavior, and as I say, that the link you sent, or I posted up earlier that you mentioned, Monica, has some analysis on this. I mean, AT&T was fairly aggressive in that it wanted a lot of spectrum, but it dropped down over time. I think what was interesting was how much Verizon kind of held out for. And as a result of that, sort of prices ended up being relatively high. I mean, you raise an interesting question. What if the merger hadn't happened, the T-Mobile Sprint merger hadn't happened? I mean, I think it would still be an interesting situation because you'd have Sprint with all of its 2.5 gigahertz spectrum holdings and all of Verizon, AT&T and T-Mobile looking to say, well, we need lots of mid-band spectrum there. Now, the question is, on the one hand, you would say, well, okay, there's 3 people then really desperate to get a lot of spectrum. Could the competition have been more? But on the other hand, the other argument is how much of a threat is having all that spectrum? And you could argue that, Sprint's brand positioning was not as great as the new T-Mobile. So would Sprint have been viewed as less of a threat, even if it's got all this spectrum, it's got the sort of race ahead? In terms of the damage it could do to the other operators, would it have been viewed as a little bit less strong there? Whereas probably the feeling I think probably Verizon and AT&T had here was, the new T-Mobile, it's got all its Un-carrier branding and everything, quite a strong brand presence. And then it would also have the spectrum to translate into a very sort of high performance 5G network. Well, it already has sort of got a high performance 5G network out there, which the others can't compete with without having this additional spectrum. So yeah, it's difficult to say which way it would have gone. Interesting.
Well, actually, there was one comment that somebody sent ahead of the Sparring Partners about the fact that maybe T-Mobile got the best deal in terms of mid-band spectrum when they purchased Sprint. It's very difficult to break apart the value of the spectrum, but clearly, I mean, 2.5 is better than 3.5 in terms of propagation. And although that's kind of more of a secondary market, so there is not the same type of license. it's more leased from the spectrum holders, but maybe it was.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, they paid what, 26 billion, and obviously T-Mobile paid 26 billion, and obviously took on debt as well, I guess. But you know, if you look at that in comparison with what was paid for spectrum, I mean, it looks like it was a good deal given just how much spectrum the new T-Mobile now has as a result of that acquisition. And as I say, I think you know, in terms of the threat to Verizon and AT&T, just to repeat myself, the combination of the spectrum with the brand presence is probably quite powerful.
Yeah. It's and I think that that sort of says something about the merger. Actually, I think it did help the competition in the US in creating a third strong operator rather than having four operators where two are strong and two are a little bit kind of struggling to get enough market share. Because when it comes to it, this is a market where you do need to have volume. I mean, number of subscribers, you do much better, you're more efficient that way.
Yeah, here's an interesting thought though. I mean, on that one, I think the jury's a little bit out. I mean, in the short term, it's definitely good for competition because you've got this, as I say, strong T-Mobile with the brand and the network. But is there a risk that over time you've kind of got three parties all pretty much the same size? Is there a risk that they kind of settle into a nice triopoly, you know, and the level of competition starts to decrease? Whereas, and I know there are smaller players in the market, so you know, particular markets have more. So this is a sort of very broad simplification. I accept that, but you know, it's as I say, is there a possibility that you get this triopoly and it becomes a little bit cozy, and it'll be, you know, how do you keep the competitive tension going? It'll be interesting to see over time how that one works out.
Yeah, but there was a little bit. There was less compared to other countries. It seems like there was less competition in the US even when there were four operators, because they still kind of have the instead of how is it, a duopoly when you have four operators, but it's still kind of like um, it just seems like competition is not just the number of operators.
No, it is very much the intensity between them, and you can have the same market which has three operators, which is a cozy triopoly, and then another market with three operators where they're really fighting with each other. The thing is, I think there's a bigger risk when everything's symmetrical, you know, so there's a sort of symmetrical market share, symmetrical positions. There's less incentive, whereas if you've got a sort of, you know, somebody who's a bit, it's not symmetrical. Maybe you've got a smaller player that's looking to eat market share. Maybe that adds a little bit of, and maybe perhaps a worse network, so they have to compete more on price. Maybe that adds something to competition. I don't know. You know, there is something. I think there is some little thing about having a bit of asymmetry there, just to create some tension.
Yeah, in the chat. So if you want to ask questions, please ask them in the Q&A now in the chat if you can. But there is one about the UK auction. There was a UK auction that just got completed, and it was interesting. The price in that case there was competition, but not as high. So the price didn't go much more the initial setting price. And there was a 1.7 and 3.68 spectrum that was assigned. Now, I would say so. We're not going to get into that, but there is that, and then there is also another interesting outcome, which is in India, where 60% of the spectrum for 5G was actually not sold. It just sat there because I guess the reserve price was considered to be too high. So let's say if you just look at it sort of that from a global point of view, how does this relate to the results that we see in other countries?
This is interesting. So I think generally, I mean, I think as you said in your introductory remarks, you know, some of these prices look to be somewhat ahead, you know, maybe double, maybe even triple of what you would see in other markets. And I can, you know, in some of those other markets, some of those prices were seen as relatively high. And you raised an interesting point about India, you know, where the spectrum has just not been assigned because the reserve price was too high. And the interesting thing with India was, you know, this is particularly in relation to low band spectrum, 700 megahertz spectrum. And the interesting thing is the government had a go at selling this in 2016. with a high reserve price, and it didn't get sold there either. On this particular occasion, they've come back, they've reduced the reserve price, I think, to around about 55–60%, if I remember rightly, of what it was in 2016, and it still hasn't been assigned. And you know, I remember just before the 2016 auction, I went to a Spectrum conference where the regulator put up the price. And to be fair to the regulator, I think it's the ministry that ultimately decides this rather than the regulator. But I think it was the regulator that put up the prices. And the point was made was this is extremely high when you compare to other countries, particularly when you consider, you know, you look at the US, the ARPUs in the US are, you know, $60–70. The ARPUs in India are like $2 per person. You know, it's a world of difference in terms of wealth, but the actual sort of Spectrum prices are more like, you know, Western prices. I mean, the reserve price in India was 34 cents per megahertz pop, you know, which is higher than you would have probably seen in the equivalent US auctions in terms of the reserve price, albeit I think the final outcome of the 700 in the US was about 75 cents, so about double. But, you know, the wealth per person in India is somewhat less than half in the States. So yeah, the regulator was saying at this conference, you know, everyone tells us we have these crazy prices, but the Spectrum always sells. So what they do is the next auction then has a higher reserve price than the previous auction's outcome. And then in 2016, this rule broke. You know, I think the guy was a bit unfortunate because after saying all this, the next auction it broke. Maybe it was his invitation for the industry to tell him that this is the, you know, this is too much. So that held off, and then the regulators and the ministry have been perhaps a little bit more reasonable, but even now it's still too high. And also there's been a lot of consolidation in the Indian market. So in 2016, you might have had, you know, 6 or so operators going for this. Now you have 3, and it looks like they've all basically said, look, we're fed up with paying these ridiculous amounts. We're going to hold off and hope that the regulator reduces it further. But let's see. It will be interesting to tell.
Yeah. Well, you know, I guess that's sort of like if you go back to the US, you know, operators paid more, but we as consumers, as subscribers, will also pay more. So maybe it's all fair, you know, because somebody is paying for it. So there you go. Now, it's sort of as a sort of like when you compare US to other markets, in most countries, you know, the licenses are issued on a national basis. So when I was looking at the UK results, 10 seconds, it's clear who got the spectrum, it's national, that's it. And that simplicity not only makes it easy to look at the results, but also makes it sort of like the overall sense of what the different operators are doing seems to be easier and better because you are a national operator. What would have happened and would have been better if in the US we would have a national assignments of spectrum as it is in most countries?
Well,
we don't usually think, we sort of take it, we're so used in the US, we take it for granted. But if it were like other countries, wouldn't it sort of be better?
Well, it's a very interesting question. You know, it's always interesting coming to work in the US because whenever you work on looking at spectrum benchmarks and you try and compare, not only is spectrum awarded on a regional basis in the US, different frequency bands have different regions, different shapes, if you like, of the spectrum. So you can have with very different sizes of area as well. So it adds an even further complexity. And to be honest, I think it's fundamentally just for historical reasons, really. I mean, you know, when spectrum was first made available for mobile in the US, you know, we all know the history. It was all about sort of first come, first served, and then lotteries for the spectrum. And it was for very, you know, licenses in discrete areas. So, you know, every man and his dog, as it were, sort of, you know, got you know, applied for a license and got a license for their area. And then to create these sort of big national carriers, obviously, you know, there's been lots and lots of acquisitions over time, mergers and acquisitions over time to create these national entities. But because the spectrum licenses were originally awarded in small form, in these very small units, this thing has all stuck through. I mean, on the one hand, it makes life very difficult, for analysts and the likes to try and work out what's going on, and for the bidders. I mean, even more importantly, for the big operators, it's not as clean a process and a much more complicated analytical process and a bidding process compared to countries where there's single national licenses or even big regions, big regional blocks. But at the same time, I suppose, we have a lot of these smaller operators in the US, local operators and the likes, which may have roaming agreements with some of the bigger parties. And, the bigger, over time, there have been opportunities for the bigger parties and those to merge, but they've managed to keep their own business going for whatever reasons. And I suppose the argument they would have is, whose business is it for the government, the regulator, to effectively, if they started awarding national licenses, it kind of destroys their business in the future, because obviously they can't bid for a national license. I wonder if there's some hybrid solutions, some sort of, part of the band could be made available in national blocks, and some of the blocks could be made available in a more smaller piecemeal basis. I don't know. It's a very interesting question, but I think it's, as I say, historical reasons are the main reason.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of, at the beginning, there were like, people that didn't have not operators just getting licenses to sell them as as an investment opportunity. And when you think about, again, for historical reasons, it all makes sense. It just seems like at this point, it just doesn't, wireless cellular networks really a kind of business where size matters. So I think that, in terms of not just for us analysts, but in general, for the operators and for the subscribers, I think that there would be some advantage of having sort of like more of a national operator with national holdings across the country, so that as you move around, you still have coverage regardless of where you have, sort of like a more uniform. And I think that would actually help competition, because then the operators would be competing on a more even ground in terms of coverage. So I think that there would be some some advantage there. And then you could have, I guess, some, because also the idea that you have new entrants coming in. In this auction we've seen, it's actually was AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. Dish didn't do, and there is a question about why Dish didn't get any spectrum.
Indeed.
And the cable operators that are supposedly always going to come in and roll out this big network, it just didn't happen. So is it really encouraging competition? It doesn't look like. And I think that, we go back to Dish. Dish has a lot of spectrum. They haven't had a network. So I think that it's actually a good idea if they focus on building the network rather than spending the cash that they might have on new spectrum.
Well, the interesting thing though is if you look on their bidding behavior, and I think on the web link we mentioned, I think we have the example of New York on our paper. The interesting thing with Dish is they bid in big blocks. So they first of all bid in New York, for example, New York City. They first bid for 200 megahertz. Then they dropped down to 100. I think roughly when the price got to about, I think it was roughly about 20% of the final price. And then they dropped down to from 100 straight to 0. Once it got to 40% of the final price. And that sort of big jumps is very, we found that a little bit strange. I'm sure there's method in it, there's logic in it, but, was it really absolutely critical to get 100 megahertz or 200? Could you possibly survive with 180 or 160? The more conventional behaviors, you kind of drop down gradually rather than these big lumps. So, it's difficult to know what big Dish was thinking there. Was it because they really could only see value in these big blocks? Because with their other spectrum bands, they've got use. But why not 140 though? Why not 160? That's a big block and a useful block still. And over time, although sort of the immediate systems only support 100, if you had 160, you could put in 280s, and over time the systems would support it. So just that behavior is a little bit strange. I know some people have been speculating, were they only ever in this just to drive the price up for everybody else? And maybe some behavior like this may be suggesting they weren't thinking so much about how they use the spectrum, and it was more a put the price up, but obviously make sure we're not in for too much in case it does go up too high. Who knows?
or maybe it was the other way around. It's like you just try to get if it's cheap enough, because it's a way, then it's kind of spectrum hoarding basically. If it's cheap
Mm.
enough, there's a value and somebody's going to be willing to pay for it. It's very different from, say, the cable operators that didn't even go in, so clearly they were like, we are
Yeah,
not interested.
yeah, indeed.
Dish
I mean,
was kind of like, yeah, well, we can if it's cheap enough.
the interesting thing about this speculative play, I always find interesting because in an auction like this, and we have got a situation. I think it was Grain Management that have come out with 10, 20 megahertz of spectrum in 10 areas. Which
Yeah.
sounds like a private equity play, sounds like a speculative play. I might be wrong, but it sounds like that.
Yeah.
It's always interesting because to win that spectrum, you've beaten all the people who want that spectrum. So what is it that do you know about some secret person who will want it in 10 years time, or you really believe it's going to accumulate value in that time? To actually if you can get it at reserve price and the reserve price is low, and the reason why it hasn't sold is because the caps stop the normal players from getting it, I can see a speculative play there. But to come in and go for a huge competition, contribute towards the 95 billion bill, as it were, are you really going to be able to sell this for more than you bought it for? Particularly, I think they've bought it in some sort of key markets as well. So, they've had to beaten everyone. They've come in and stayed in when, Verizon's walked away, AT&T have walked away, T-Mobile has walked away in terms of their overall demand. So, it's higher than those parties' valuations, essentially. So it's an interesting one.
It's interesting, and they don't stand to gain from raising the prices. So for Dish, if you for Dish, another one operator to have Verizon pay more, there is an advantage to them, so to say.
Mm,
But a private equity doesn't gain anything from raising the price for everybody else. So
no.
it really doesn't make any sense. But then again, it wasn't really a determinant factor in the overall auction. We didn't see a whole lot of that happening.
No, no.
Uh,
So,
yeah.
in terms of, what do all these prices mean? We've had a very interesting question, from Adia Jibulu. When Spectrum sells for high prices, the perennial question is, will it have a knock-on effect on investments, or has the auction been very effective? What do you think? This is a huge debate from economists, isn't it? And Adi's an economist by nature.
Yeah.
I kind of take the view that if it's a one-shot game, if it's a one-shot, one auction and one particular price goes particularly high, it's just the nature of that auction. Probably the parties most affected are the shareholders, because it's essentially, all the operators still have to compete on 5G, and if they don't compete on 5G and don't invest in their network, their revenues are going to suffer. So it's kind of a sunk cost, and there's still an incentive to keep going. But on the other hand, if you end up with auction after auction after auction putting high prices on, it's like the cost of anything else. If the cost of your staff goes up over time, and the cost of your land or whatever keeps going up over time, at a fast rate, of course, at some point, that has to be recovered, through the consumer. So at some point, I think it would start to affect prices and investment and the likes. But possibly one auction going high, maybe not, but Spectrum generally being ridiculously, priced at a very high price again and again and again, I think it would do. But I know this is a huge matter of economic debate, so there's no one agreed answer amongst the community.
Yeah, and I guess that's really, yeah, you cannot address, but it's clearly an interesting issue. But like in this case, you'd imagine that if you pay more than like in this case, people in the US pay more than other countries. Okay, but that doesn't mean that they're going to sit on the spectrum, because then they don't have money to
Mm.
deploy. So I don't see that that will stop them from deploying, because and they know that they've done their math. So they know that they can afford to deploy. So I don't think that it's going to have an effect on investment, as you say, in the short term. In the long term, if you start paying for spectrum much more, clearly that cost is going to be passed to the consumer, to the subscribers. There is no other way, because you still need to be profitable. In the US, there is a little bit more room in terms of that now having to be passed, because subscribers do pay more than probably in another country compared to to the cost. But I think that there is a public policy issue in terms of, do you want to, as a regulator, to encourage these high prices when they would put the country at somewhat of a disadvantage, because there is a lot of value that is associated with the mobile network and mobile connectivity, that if you do not have, if you have higher costs, people might just use it less. So there is this other additional dimension to it. Is it good for the country to have
Indeed.
higher cost and higher cost for service, which is what we have in the US right now?
It's a very good question. And I think regulators generally aren't looking for high spectrum prices. I mean, sometimes, and I've seen this, they're being leaned on by the Treasury Department in the country. I noticed this particularly when we had the Euro crisis, in the early 2010s. Spectrum auctions in countries which were struggling suddenly got accelerated because they were seen as a key means of sort of fixing the Treasury black hole at the time. And maybe we'll see that now, with obviously all the COVID spending as well. Maybe we'll see a similar thing. But the regulators, obviously, they're not interested in raising money. They're interested in having a means of giving the spectrum out to the market in a way that, number one, will promote competition in the future and help a sort of healthy competitive market in the future. And secondly, in a way that means they won't get sued. And that's often why they go for auctions rather than beauty contests, because it's a way of, it's an open, transparent, clear process. And, as I say, they're very much looking to promote competition. And it's just how you get the balance between that. And one thing I think is a little bit unfair sometimes is when you have a high price auction. So, for example, we've had some high prices in Germany. And, I've seen the operators come up and say, well, it's the regulator's fault because there was only 300 megahertz of spectrum made available, not 400, because part of it was given to vertical industries for industrial applications and the likes. And what the operators sort of, don't forget is nobody held a gun to their head. They kept on bidding. And in particular in the German auction, and this is the history of many German spectrum auctions, if you look at the final price outcome, where the auction ended up, you often find you could have ended up with almost the same outcome at about a quarter of the price or the fifth of the price if they'd just stopped fighting with each other. It's almost they keep fighting and then they realize they're not going to win, one's not going to win. So they get, okay, stalemate. If they'd done that stalemate, a quarter of the way through the auction, they would have paid a quarter of the price or whatever. And amazing, that keeps happening in Germany. I don't know why. It's one of those, you think you'd learn from the last one, and it's like the fourth time this has happened kind of thing. So, but they still blame the regulator, so I think that's a bit of now, sometimes it is the regulator's fault. There was an auction in Italy for, again, the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum. Mm-hmm. And in this auction, the regulator only had 200 megahertz of spectrum, the 4 operators, and they created 2 licenses with 80 megahertz of spectrum and 2 licenses with 20 megahertz of spectrum. So you can imagine there was huge competition for the 80. Now, if they'd done it the conventional way of putting 20 megahertz blocks or 10 megahertz blocks, you probably would have ended up with a lower price. That was clearly designed to raise money. So sometimes I think it's fair to blame the regulator. Sometimes I think it's grossly unfair.
Yeah, and obviously, operators know know what they're doing. So, if they bid, obviously they see value. But if you look, for instance, at CBRS in the US, where you have was much less spectrum, but people paid less because the power was less, and so they were trying to encourage free use, and there were some restrictions. But that's a way to create some spectrum availability to the wider audience to increase the usage. I mean, who has access to the spectrum and have a lower pricing. So there are ways in which a regulator can actually sort of encourage lower pricing because of the features of the spectrum, right?
And the features, and also the auction rules, how you set the auction rules, the amount of transparency you give, and all that kind of thing. It can have a big impact on the price. So, yeah, no, there is a lot the regulators can do to keep prices low if they choose.
Now, I see that there is a question that says that the polls indicates that the viewers didn't believe that the spectrum is worth the price, and then 5G is so far is one of the most overhyped technologies ever. It will take time from there to be, to recover the cost and to produce services. Now, I actually, I do have a problem with this kind of view. First of all, I don't think that 5G is overhyped. Necessarily, from a technology point from an access technology point of view, it's good. It's better than 4G. It's more cost effective. What's wrong with that? I think that what's overhyped, there is a overhype. It's the belief that just because you have a new technology that it's more spectrally efficient, you're going to make a truckload of money. That's just not going to happen. It's not 5G, or it's not. It's just it just doesn't happen, because the amount of money that people are willing and can spend on wireless, it's not going to change all that much. It's not that because you have 5G, no matter how great the technology is, they're going to pay twice as much starting tomorrow. Even Verizon predicts like a 3-4% increase in revenues, and I think that even that is generous. Operators are not going to charge more just because they have 5G. I got my new 5G phone. There's no change in my plan. And why should there be? I'm just going to do the same things. It's not like I'm going to pay more to have what? To have virtual reality? Am I going to pay $20 more a month? No. So I think that, it is overhyped if you think that you're going to get all the services that we have seen it with 3G, with 4G, and it didn't happen. It's not going to happen with 5G either, I think. So I think that the issue of the spectrum prices relate to the fact that we do need more capacity and we need more spectrum. It's not necessarily 5G per se. It's the fact that we need more capacity. What do you think? I mean, obviously Midband is for 5G, but that's not. It's just that we need more spectrum.
So I think there's a few things going on. I mean, I think operators, exactly as you say, Monica, there's a sort of growth in demand of traffic, and you need more spectrum to serve that. And if you don't have that additional spectrum, you have to do more costly things like putting out new cell sites and the like. So that's a big factor driving the value of the spectrum. The other big thing is, I sort of describe sort of new technologies as a little bit like a nuclear arms race, in the sense that if nobody had the new technology, if nobody had 5G, you could survive. You as an operator could survive with 4G because that's the world you're in. Everybody's got 4G. But as soon as someone has 5G, then you've all got to do it, because if you don't have it, you're going to lose a lot of customers and the likes. And arguably, this is going back to the sort of original point about this auction. You're in a situation where T-Mobile has this wonderful 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. It's covering 100 million people with it, and offering these high speeds. Now, what the hell do you do if you're not in that situation? The only way you can compete is by also acquiring a big block of spectrum. And there's a huge value. I mean, if you lose or gain 1% of market share, that's a lot of value. It doesn't, or 1 percentage point. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you actually translate that into money, it's actually quite a lot of value. So that's that I suspect what's driven the spectrum price is a combination of three things. Number one, as we discussed, the value of reducing your network costs. Number two, fighting against T-Mobile, protecting yourself against T-Mobile. But also number three, there's probably a little bit of views of maybe there are some new revenue opportunities for 5G, and the jury's out as to whether these will come off and how big they are. I suspect they'll be relatively modest, but I think we've had some questions about use of 5G for industrial applications and the likes. And I think the interesting thing there is, I think there'll be some industrial applications which manufacturers and the likes just want control of. They have control of everything else in their factory. They'll want control of the radio system so they can have 99.999 whatever it is % availability. And in which case, that's more about sort of private spectrum, CBRS and the likes. But there will be some organizations that are happy to use the public network, and there is and they will need some things on 5G that maybe weren't available on 4G. But as I say, I mean, I think there is a market there, but how big it is, I'm a little bit skeptical about. And you wouldn't pay 95 billion just for that market. It has to be I think it's mainly driven by the other two factors. This is probably a very small element of that 95 billion, I suspect.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yes, there is all the enterprise, or car connectivity to cars, and there are some services that will drive an increase, because you're basically addressing not the usual subscriber market. It's not like subscribers, so the ARPU will not go up, but there will be different sources of revenues. But again, does that justify that amount of money? Probably not. And I don't think that that's the reason why they're doing it. Or actually, fixed wireless access is another one. So sure, that might be, but I don't think anybody would get mid-band spectrum for fixed wireless access, because you can use other bands. But and I think that you point a very important issue, is that by having more spectrum, operators can deploy the infrastructure in a more cost-effective way. So you could use millimeter wave to cover the whole country, but it would be ridiculously expensive.
Indeed.
So it's not like you cannot get the capacity you need otherwise. It's just be inefficient. It would be expensive and not the right way to go. And so moving to that, so there are two things. Is the first, other mid-band, other spectrum bands, and we can get to that later. But before we get there, how is this, the fact that now finally we have more mid-band spectrum available, is that going to change how much millimeter wave is used or CBRS is used? And actually, let's do the poll first, I guess, and then I forgot about it. We have a poll on this. So Kendra, could we get the second poll, and then we can talk about that?
Okay, great. Our second poll is 2 questions. The first question is, what is the impact of mid-band licensed spectrum availability on CBRS? Will it reduce or slow down CBRS deployments? Will it have a neutral, no impact, or will it have a positive impact, increase or accelerate CBRS deployments? And the second question, what is the impact of mid-band licensed spectrum availability on millimeter wave? And our options are negative, reduce or slow down millimeter wave deployments, neutral, no impact, or increase or accelerate deployments.
And I think that the we tend to look at each band as sort of as a standalone thing, but when you look at it increasingly, a cellular network, initially it was like a 2G network, limited bands and everything, but now you have more and more bands and technologies that coexist. So really the value of a cellular network, no matter who you are, it comes from different bands and how the bands integrate with each other. And then the cost associated with it is going to be different. So the kind of network structure that you have, architecture and topology that you have at different bands, is going to be very different if you are in a rural environment or urban or suburban environment. So I think that it's more and more important to look at the overall package there.
Yeah, it's that portfolio of spectrum. I completely agree that matters fundamentally. Having that mix of what we call the sort of low frequency spectrum for the wide coverage, the mid band to get good coverage but at higher speeds, and then the sort of millimeter wave spectrum or whatever you like for the sort of hotspots.
Yeah. Okay, Kendra, why don't we look at the results?
Yeah.
Okay, for the impact of mid-band licensed spectrum availability on CBRS, we have 53% of attendees thought it would have no impact, and 25% thought it might have a negative impact, meaning it might reduce or slow down CBRS deployments, while 22% thought it might increase or accelerate CBRS deployments. And for our second question about mid-band licensed spectrum availability impacts on millimeter wave, we had 50% of attendees saying it would reduce or slow down millimeter wave deployments. 33% thought it would have no impact, and 17% thought it would have a positive impact, aka increase or accelerate deployments.
Yeah, so for the millimeter wave, I agree, because it's just like there is less of a urgency, or at least what I think is that it's going to change the way millimeter wave will be used. So I would imagine that would move to have more of a use of indoor millimeter wave, but that's my own pet thing.
Yeah, so. I think the millimeter wave will be kind of much more for the kind of, if you like, the hot spots, the sports stadiums or whatever, the places where there's, or it might be sort of transport hotspots or wherever, the places where you've got a real high density of users. So instead of you trying to cover the whole city center, you'll just do it in limited place in the city center. And I'm sure I mean Verizon has sort of put out its statement that it's going to continue deploying its millimeter wave and increase the number of its spots. And I'm sure, I'm sure it will do, but I wouldn't be surprised also if you like its grand scheme that it had for millimeter wave. Now that it's, now that C-band came onto the agenda much quicker than anybody thought, I mean, Verizon's come away with 160 megahertz of spectrum. You asked them 3 years ago, are you going to get 160 megahertz of spectrum in the midband? They would say, where on earth from? It wouldn't be believable. So I'm sure they will change their plans, to reflect this big acquisition of C-band. And, Verizon, it will be much more for the hotspots.
Well, and also, if you think about it, they're going to have a certain amount of money that they have for deployments,
Yeah.
So might as well use that one for C-band rather than millimeter wave, because it seems like it would be a higher return on investment.
Absolutely. And you can put the C-band straight on your existing cell sites as well. It's much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about CBRS? I think actually here I agree with the response, because the way I see CBRS again is just either for very specific areas or for industrial or private network type of deployments where the C-band has really no impact.
I mean, again, Verizon in the short term is using it as part of its network, but I think that's more of a stopgap, before the C-band becomes available. And, at the time when we had the CBRS auction, we thought, Verizon spent quite a bit of money on this, 2 billion. But you know what, when you compare the 2 billion to the 54 billion, spending 2 million to fill a gap doesn't look actually that bad, in those terms. It looks like a very reasonable price to fill a gap. I mean, the interesting question is, as Verizon, as the C-band becomes available for Verizon, it'll be less dependent on the CBRS, and could that therefore give more, it might make less use of it and give more scope to all the other licensees and the general authorized access users to get more access than they might otherwise have done.
Yeah, or it could help Verizon to get in the enterprise, because basically they have a way to help the enterprise.
Indeed.
And which is why I'm not so sure, so Dish is arguing to raise the power level for CBRS, and I don't think it's necessarily a good idea, because true, you can have wider reach, but then you kind of lose the ability to use CBRS for small cells and for private networks, for GAA, because if you can blast the signal everywhere,
it's harder. Indeed. This is a clash. This is a classic Dish arbitrage move, right? You buy spectrum when it's got these conditions. And then you release the conditions. Suddenly, worth much more. You can sell it for much more. It's a classic arbitrage.
Yeah. Now, there was the very first question about the band in the lower C band. What is it? 5 gigahertz. So there are a bunch of other bands that are going to become available, but right now the interest is on the 3.4
3.45 to 3.55,
which is just right below the CBRS band, and that's going to be auctioned in October,
November,
right? Yeah, and so that's also another interesting one, because within the US we still have more limited C-band spectrum available compared to other countries, which tend to be more. We have like 280 megahertz now. In most countries, it's like in many countries it's like 500. So that should also have encourage a C-band. What do you think is going to happen there? I mean, it just seems like it's a good thing, more spectrum, but
I think it's good to have. I think it's good to have more spectrum. I mean, the slight problem is it's kind of 100 megahertz on its own, and also within that 100 megahertz, I understand the regulators thinking of putting a cap on 40 megahertz per party. So the most anyone can get is 40 megahertz, and if you compare that to Verizon having its 160 megahertz, it could have two 80 megahertz carriers. AT&T's got its 80, it can have a big 80 megahertz carrier. 40 megahertz, it gives you something extra, but not that much. And you're going to have another radio to do it and everything. So I think there will be some value there, but I'd be very surprised if the prices get anything like this. Probably, I mean, if I'm sort of crystal ball gazing, I would say that AT&T will be looking at the outcome of C-band going, oh gosh, our biggest competitor Verizon's got 160, roughly across the markets. We've got 80. maybe, you know, T-Mobile's got a big amount in 2.5 and some more here. Maybe we're a little bit behind here. Maybe we should go hard on this one. So probably I would expect AT&T to be the biggest buyer, but I think the others, Verizon and T-Mobile, will probably drop away, you know, reduce, well, not drop away completely, but reduce their demand. And the cap anyway, the 40 megahertz cap limits the amount of competition that there's going to be for this. So I'd expect the price to be somewhat lower.
Yeah, and I don't see that as to be as a game changer, because again, it's not
No.
it's a good amount of spectrum, but it's not going to change, and it's
Yeah.
not going to allow it, you know, with the caps, and it's not like you're going to say, oh, somebody like Dish is going to get it all. I mean, it's not going to happen either, or Comcast or a cable operator. So I think it's just going to be padding the spectrum needs of the top three, really. And so it's good, you know, the more spectrum the better, but I don't think it's going to be, you know, a game changer in that respect. I guess that it'd be more interesting to see, you know, to see sort of higher bands, and I am curious to see, you know, are we going to see more of an indoor specific coverage, like with millimeter wave and other bands, because you know you do need there's a lot of coverage that it's for indoor. I mean, you need a lot of indoor coverage, and that might be driven by more by private networks and enterprises and venue owners rather than operators.
Well, here's the thing about sort of the private networks and the likes. I mean, you know, the FCC is making 1200 megahertz of spectrum available on a license exempt basis. And of course, the big obvious thing to use that for is Wi-Fi, but also 5G, unlicensed 5G, you know, 5G new radio, unlicensed, can also use that spectrum as well. So, you know, there are opportunities, you know, there's a whole slug of spectrum for that kind of sort of local use there as well. So, possibly, you know, that's the big answer to that one for at least in the sort of medium term.
Yeah. Well, you know, if you think about it right now, most of the mobile traffic, I mean, the traffic from mobile devices goes through Wi-Fi.
Indeed.
And you need that because otherwise it would be really expensive for the operators to carry all that traffic. So
Absolutely.
it's but the operators are not actually paying for that infrastructure. So, like for instance, with the 6 gigahertz spectrum available, it's a huge amount of spectrum that could be used for Wi-Fi, or as I said, for 5G NRU. You know, that is going to take a lot of the traffic load. Now, whether that's going to be 5G NRU, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think it's because for an operator to have Wi-Fi, it's perfect. They don't have to pay for it, and there is free offload.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing is if you think about sort of, you know, things that generate a lot of potentially generate a lot of traffic. You know, there's things, you know, like laptops, televisions, and the likes. I mean, they already have Wi-Fi built in. Putting a 5G radio in is a sort of big step. I think Wi-Fi is going to continue to be the main thing, but there might be some things that need the specialist things that 5G can do. You know, the latency and the likes. And it might be, you know, I mean, Wi-Fi is also evolving, right? So the next version of Wi-Fi may also do this. But so, you know, I suspect Wi-Fi's got a big role to play, but will play the biggest role. But 5G may have a niche role as well. 5G unlicensed may also have a niche role.
Yeah, I was just sort of like I sort of forgot to look at the Q&A, but we have a few minutes, and there is a sort of a general high-level question about the efficiency in spectrum use, and can we? And the other question is, can we get rid of auctions and to have technology take care of managing interference? Well, I think that, you know, the reason why you have auction is not just to allocate spectrum. It's not just to manage interference, but to allocate the use of the band. So on one hand, I think that there might be something different, like what they're doing in the UK, so that if you don't use the spectrum, even though you have a license, you should allow somebody else to use it and share spectrum. So I'm all for it, but at the same time, I don't see that as a way to avoid auction or to allocate spectrum, because you do need to have spectrum allocations if you want to have national coverage. Or, you know, you can just ask people, just go and deploy it, and it's all share. I mean, share spectrum is important, but it's not the solution.
No. I mean, there is the sort of holy grail, as it were, which is that maybe one day all spectrum will be assigned on a dynamic basis. You know, we'll have really sophisticated algorithms and all that to come. But I suspect we're a good 20 years away from anything, that really taking over everything, which is great because there's still jobs for spectrum managers in the meantime.
Yeah, but even if you allocate it dynamically, you still need to have at some point somebody that has the right to use the spectrum whenever they need it, because otherwise, how could if I'm, well, let's say Verizon, why am I going to spend all this money to deploy a network nationwide when anybody can use it? I
No,
mean,
no. I suppose you. I
there is,
suppose.
you know.
I suppose you're kind of looking at sort of something more dynamic though. So instead of paying now for the next 20 years, you pay as you need it. So almost like an Uber type model, if you need the spectrum now, if there's lots of demand, the price goes up in the way that Ubers go up. If nobody needs it, the price is very low. That's sort of, but that's literally, every second or, whatever, rather than it being for every 20 years or 10 years, you have this auction, if you see what I mean. It's almost like a microscopic auction, keep running every few seconds or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, by the way.
Yeah, I need to. Yeah, I think we need to go. But I think that was. Do we have any? I don't know where we've gone. As usual, we haven't been able to go through all the questions, but maybe we'll try to answer them offline, or have another. Maybe we should have another one to see what happened with the spectrum. Um, yeah, is there anything else? I think okay. I think we need to go because everybody has to get to their own lives and continue. But it was great talking to you, Amit.
Yeah, likewise.
And,
The hour flew by. Amazing.
and Kendra, back over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude our webinar for today. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Senza Fili website in the coming days, as will a podcast version of the discussion. And just to let you know, we have 2 webinars coming up, Pioneering in Building 5G Spectrum and Architecture in April, and another webinar on CBRS 5G and Terragraph. That will be May 13th. And the registration for those will be available on the Senza Fili website in the coming days. Thanks again to our speakers and participants, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.